So, when we had left off last time, we were examining this perceptual dimension of morality. Specifically, the fact that humans tend to perceive the actions of other humans, and sometimes not even actions, but other people's thoughts and beliefs, along this continuum of right and wrong, or morally virtuous to immoral. So murder tends to be viewed on this wrong end of the spectrum, but it isn't always viewed that way. For instance, murder in self-defense, usually viewed as morally acceptable by many people. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, we have things like altruistic giving, charitable donations. These things tend to be perceived as morally virtuous, but not always. For instance, very few people would tend to appreciate the altruistic donation that someone made to a political group they disagreed with. Like if someone made a very charitable donation to a hate group, a lot of people would probably say that this isn't exactly good. So sometimes behaviors are perceived as good, sometimes they're perceived as bad. A lot of it depends on context, and there's this whole perceptual dimension that we're talking about here. And as we noted, this is really a rather strange dimension of perception, because it doesn't seem to reflect the objective characteristics of the world, or of human behavior for that matter. You can't measure or detect the immorality of an act the same way that you can detect other stimuli we perceive, like wavelengths of light or sound, or the presence of chemical compounds that you smell. You can detect those. You can't detect whether an act is moral or not. So when perceiving a moral element in the world, it's clear we're trying to estimate something about the behavior. But it's not immediately obvious at first glance what this thing we're trying to estimate is. We also saw last time that morality does not seem to be necessarily estimating overall welfare gains. The things that leave the most people better off aren't necessarily perceived to be morally acceptable. And we saw an example of this when it came to the trolley and the footbridge dilemmas. And here, a majority of the people that tend to be surveyed about these say it's okay for someone to divert a runaway train onto a sidetrack so that it kills one person instead of 5. But most people also say it's morally unacceptable to push a heavy person in front of that train to save the life of 5 people down the tracks. So even though the welfare gains are the same in both of these scenarios, one person dies so 5 people can live, the perception of the morality of these acts varies dramatically. And findings like these cut against the idea that morality is some kind of altruism device that evolved to make groups of people better off. Indeed, many people are going to judge acts as wrong, even if they will tell you consciously they don't think anyone else was made worse off because of them. And we saw examples of this in moral dumbfounding. To review some of that literature briefly, there were people, a lot of them, who consistently judged consensual incest, through which no children were born, and everyone involved was happier and better off emotionally. They still judge that to be wrong, regardless of its proximate lack of consequences. Everyone was better off, no one was worse off, but people will still say the act was immoral. And in the moral literature, this is referred to as the philosophy of non-consequentialism. It represents an entire branch of philosophy and thinking about morality. And in this view, behaviors themselves are either right or wrong, regardless of the consequences. That is, some people will say lying is wrong, regardless of whether lying makes people better off. And this focus on behavior itself, distinct from its consequences, is an odd feature of our moral psychology. And it's one we have to explain. And we have to explain it because it's not like consequences never matter. To be sure, consequences do matter to our moral judgments, inasmuch as people are regularly attempting to explain why things are right or wrong in terms of the consequences that occur because of them. So why they matter sometimes, why consequences matter sometimes, and why consequences matter, or rather don't matter sometimes, this is also not immediately obvious. And we further reviewed a very important explanatory link between moral conscience and moral condemnation. What you'd refer to as your moral compass, the things that are guiding your behavior. Conscience is what regulates your own behavior, while condemnation tends to regulate the behavior of other people. And as we saw, conscience doesn't explain condemnation very well, because not wanting to do something yourself does not, in any straightforward way, explain why you think other people should not be permitted to do so, and in fact should be punished for doing so. However, condemnation does explain conscience pretty well. If other people in the world are going to punish you for taking certain actions, then conscience can be viewed as having this defense function. It preemptively stops you from taking behaviors that are going to be punished by other people, so you can avoid the costs of punishment. So this left us with the matter of trying to explain moral condemnation. The real question that we're trying to understand today is, why do third parties are these people who aren't directly involved in a conflict, why do they purposefully entangle themselves in the conflicts of others on the basis of these moral perceptions, and why do they punish other people? After all, if you're looking to avoid the costs of a conflict, and they are very costly, one great way to do so is just to avoid the conflicts altogether, to not involve yourself in other people's business and not involve yourself in other people's fights. We're really trying to figure out here, why do people think certain behaviors should be punished, and why are they entering into disputes on the basis of behaviors instead of entering into disputes because, say, someone is a family member or someone is a friend? In order to enter into these conflicts, there have to be compensating gains to the costs of the conflict. In the case of family and friends, this is pretty easy. You're supporting your family, you're supporting your friends, they could share genes with you, they could have histories with you that make you more valuable to them. You might take the side because of who they are. But why are you taking sides in a conflict because of what they did? That's a very curious thing to explain. Why do people ever do that? So what are the relevant fitness gains that humans might acquire from involving themselves in the conflicts of others, using these moral perceptions as guides for when and how to get involved? And how are the features of our moral judgments explained in light of those benefits? How does the function explain the form of morality? So this brings us to my theory as to the adaptive function of our moral psychology, which I called Moral Alliance Strategies Theory. And I called it that because that simplifies to MAST as an acronym. And I thought that would really help the branding because it makes it easier to remember. MAST. Moral Alliance Strategies Theory. The general idea that I proposed is as follows. Alliances, friendships, and other forms of social relationships are key factors to human reproductive success. We regularly rely on the support of other people to stay alive, to thrive, and to overcome the challenges of life. However, these relationships that we have with others don't just come into existence by default, and they don't just provide benefits to us by default. They need to be initiated at some point. You have to go from having no relationship to some relationship, and they need to be maintained only to the extent that their benefits outweigh their costs. Relationships that don't end up providing adequate benefits relative to their costs should be abandoned, just as new relationships that show promise should be pursued and established. And these relationships are costly to build and maintain because they are often very reciprocally altruistic. I'm going to help you today at some cost to myself so that you help me tomorrow at some cost to yourself. If a friend isn't willing to incur a cost to help you, they're probably not a very good friend. And if you aren't willing to incur costs to help a friend of yours, then you're probably not a very good friend to them either. Some of these friends, however, are going to require more of your time and effort than others, and some of these friends are going to be more capable and willing to provide benefits to you than others. That is, not everyone in the world is an equally good social asset. And this leaves humans with a very key adaptive problem to solve. How do you identify what relationships should be formed and where they should be broken off given your limited social budget? After all, friendship, it's kind of a zero-sum resource. A zero-sum resource is when someone gets more of something, someone else has to have less of it. And friendship is very much like that, because the more time and energy you invest in one friendship, that's time and energy you can't also simultaneously invest in other friendships. You can't be there for everybody equally all of the time. And this is especially true when people come into conflict with one another. You can't support both sides of a conflict at exactly the same time. There's a reason people have best friends through acquaintances, and not just a list of friends they value equally. You have to allocate your limited social budget in the most efficient way possible to get the best returns from it. And I believe that morality is a psychological tool that helps us manage these trade-offs. While we're not going to be able to apply this theory to every single aspect of moral judgments today, because we're working on a limited time budget ourselves, we can at least cover a variety of examples to give you a feel for what I'm talking about here. So, to better grasp how morality can help us allocate our metaphorical social budget appropriately, I want to start by covering what's referred to as the banker's paradox, because I feel the underlying logic is very similar to how morality works. Now, really, it should be called the banker's dilemma. It's not exactly a paradox, it's just a dilemma. But it goes like this. You're a banker, and as a banker, you have some amount of money you want to lend out to other people. A loan. And a loan in this case is when you give somebody money today with the promise that they're going to pay you that money back in the future with some amount of interest. So if I gave you a 5% loan, I give you $100 today, and you promise to, in a month, give me back $105. And the goal of being a banker here is to lend out the money that you have and get the highest interest rate return to you possible. So who are you going to lend it to? And we can consider two very different types of people to highlight where this dilemma lies. On the one hand, let's say you lend your money out to someone who is very poor and desperate for the money. Because their need for this money right now is so great, they're willing to accept a relatively high rate of interest on it. That is, maybe they're so needy, they say, if you give me this loan today, I will pay you back twice as much in the future, a 100% gain on your money. And that's because they're so desperate, if they don't get this money right now, they're in major trouble. There are things they have to take care of right now, and if they don't, the costs are going to be catastrophic to them. So this is a very enticing prospect for the banker. But there's a problem they have to be wary of, which is that you are lending your money to someone that is already desperately poor. And if the person's that poor, you might wonder why they're so poor and what factors might be keeping them poor. In other words, if they don't have money today, what makes you think they're going to have your money plus all of that interest in the future? If the reasons they're poor happen to be chronic issues that are likely to persist, sure, maybe they'll say they'll repay that loan to you with a lot of interest, but when the time comes to make that repayment, they might not be able to. This poor person represents a very risky investment because they might not give you your money back, but they also might have a high payoff potential where they give you more of your money back than you expected. And on the other hand, you have someone who's very rich. You might lend the money to the rich person instead. Now, because this rich person is already in good financial standing, the risk prospects on that loan fall substantially. They have a lot of money now, and this should be a pretty good indication that they're going to have money in the future to repay you. Great, your loan is now safer, but now you're encountering the opposite problem. Because the rich person already has so much money right now, their relative need for your loan is radically diminished. Nothing bad is really going to happen to them if they don't get your loan. They're already financially secure in the important aspects of life. So while the poor person might say they would repay twice your loan because their need is so great, the rich person might only be willing to pay, let's say, 5% interest on it. So here you have a safer investment, but your rate of interest has fallen substantially. So how do you, as the banker, solve this problem and figure out how to get the best return for your investment? And one possible solution to this banker's paradox here might be to look for people who are usually very well off financially, but for some reason they're experiencing a temporary or transient state of need. That is, you can imagine someone who's typically well off financially, they typically repay their debts on time, but they are facing a short-term crisis that requires a lot of money right now. Such as, let's say, their house flooded. They have severe damage to their living situation, and they need that money right now. And here the banker can find their most appealing targets of investment. Because these people are typically very well off, the probability that they're going to repay their loan is high. However, because they're also very needy in this moment, they're willing to accept a relatively higher rate of interest for that loan. But because their need isn't coming from a chronic state of affairs, people aren't regularly getting their house flooded, there's still a safe investment despite that needy status. And now the banker can get the best of both worlds. Because the money they're loaning out is valued by this person so highly that they're willing to pay a high rate of interest. They need it now. But because their needs don't tend to be chronic, the probability of repayment becomes very high. Or, to phrase this as Tooby and Cosmides did in 1996, if a person's trouble is temporary, or they can easily be returned to a position of full benefit dispensing competence by a feasible amount of assistance, then personal troubles should not make someone a less attractive object of assistance. Indeed, a person who is in this kind of trouble might be a more attractive object of investment than one who is currently safe, because the same delivered investment will be valued more by the person in dire need. Importantly, the logic underlying the banker's paradox does not apply solely to bankers and loaning money. I believe we can take this same logic on how people invest their limited social resources and use it here as well. So we're going to adapt this banker's paradox example, and we're going to go from money to social banking. You are a social banker of sorts. You have a certain amount of time and resources and energy that you can invest in other people. And your goal is to get the most back on your social investment in the forms of relationships and reciprocity. So what does it mean to get the most back in this context? Well, as we mentioned before, not everyone is equally friendly with everyone else in the social world. Social relationships can range from the best of friends to the most mortal of enemies. Which is to say, the willingness of people to invest in each other is not equally distributed. Ideally, you want the greatest amount of social investments flowing back to you in the form of more friendships, higher quality friendships, people who value your welfare more highly in general. You want this component of how much people value you to be maximized. And the other component that you're looking to maximize is the ability of your friends to invest in you socially. Because the ability of people to invest in each other is not equally distributed either. Some people are far better positioned to provide important benefits to others when they need them, whether because they have more resources available, they are more competent, they have more social connections, or a variety of other factors. Ideally, you want your friends to be able to provide you with the greatest amount of benefits, relative to be unable to provide you with those benefits. That is, if you want someone to help you move, this person has to be willing and able to lift the furniture, carry it out with you. They should be an asset, and not everyone is equally able or willing to do that. People in the social world here are varying both in terms of these dimensions of willingness and ability to provide benefits. And this, in fact, I think corresponds very well to people seeking loans and their ability and willingness to repay that loan with high interest rates. Your limited social budget That's the banker's money you're trying to lend out, and the social investment is what you're trying to get back. So to make this clearer, let's revise the banker's paradox in terms of friendship. You are looking for friends. You are a human. You are a social being. You need friends. It's important to us. And by this, I mean you're trying to find other people and have those people, make those people, for lack of a better word, deeply care about you and your welfare more than they care about the welfare of others. You want them to be caring about you in particular more than others, and you want them to be willing and able to provide you assistance to overcome life's challenges. Because you cannot be everybody's friend equally, you need to figure out where to invest your friendship building efforts to get the best friendship you can back. So, what you could do is you could try and become friends with someone who needs that friendship the most. That is, call to mind a socially isolated outcast that's been rejected by everybody else. They are extremely needy and vulnerable, and they would value your friendship greatly. However, if their state of need is chronic, that is, they're socially rejected by other people for a very good series of reasons, the relationship you form with them might become particularly one-sided, in which they consistently need your help, and they are consistently unable to return a valued assistance to you. They value you highly because they need you, and this need is driven by factors that are making it unlikely that they will meaningfully return your limited social investment, even if they want to, even if they try to. This is your high need, low probability to repay target of investment. You could also try to become friends with someone that can provide you with a lot of benefits. That is, imagine the popular kids in school, the famous celebrities, the people whose company is sought after by a great many other people. While these people could provide you with a lot of social benefits in theory, because they're already so popular, because their state of need isn't that large, they might not be that interested in building a friendship with you compared to other people, and you would risk wasting your time and effort trying to court the friendship of these very popular people. So this is your low need, high probability to repay target. So how are you going to invest your limited social resources? Like our bankers. That is, what if you could find someone who is usually a very valuable social asset that's facing a temporary state of need that you can fulfill? You happen to come across this famous celebrity broken down on the side of the road, stranded and in need of help at that moment that you can provide. This can provide you a window for initiating a very valuable social relationship, as the help that you can offer in this moment is going to be valued more highly than the typical amount of investment you could offer this person on your average day. Contexts like these are a great way to initiate new social relationships or deepen existing other relationships at a metaphorical discount. The same effort you put into that person when they're needy is going to be valued proportionately more, which makes you more valuable to them in turn. And how does all this relate to morality? Well, let's think about a stereotypical moral wrong. Stealing. Usually, people aren't getting stolen from. But when they do get stolen from, this creates in them a transient state of need. They might need to recover the resources that were stolen from them. They might need to punish the person that stole from them to send the signal that I am not to be stolen from, build a reputation. In other words, they have various temporary needs. And these needs are recovering the resources and punishing somebody. But punishment is costly to engage in. We reviewed this last time, but the thief has to be discovered. That takes time and energy. If the thief is found, they may still not just give you your stuff back. And if you try and take it back physically, they may also retaliate and try and prevent you from doing so physically. So this creates a need, someone has a need to punish, and they want to reduce the costs of engaging in this punishment. So what happens if you involve yourself in this conflict and offer your support? What might the consequences of offering this help be? Well, you do risk involving yourself in this costly fight, but now there are two of you, and two people tend to be able to win in conflicts over one person, all else being equal. So the costs of the conflict can go down, but you can also make yourself more valuable to the person who needs to punish. And this can help initiate a new social relationship where one didn't exist before, or deepen a social relationship that happens to exist. Lending your help is a credible signal that you value this person in a way that can warrant repayment in the future. In other words, involvement in these disputes can function as an ingratiation strategy. I'm getting into somebody's good graces by helping them when they need it the most. And what makes morality special in this regard is represented by the sword held in the depictions of Lady Justice. Helping someone fulfill a temporary need to punish someone, say a thief, necessarily involves inflicting a cost on the thief. So from the perspective of the person you're helping, your involvement in this moral dispute seems altruistic. You're suffering some costs related to the conflict to provide somebody else a benefit. This is why morality and altruism tend to get conflated so often. But the part that people miss is the perspective of the person you're punishing. From the perspective of the person you're punishing, this looks very spiteful. You are incurring a cost to inflict a cost on somebody else. And that creates a very important wrinkle in this moral entanglement dilemma. As we just mentioned, punishment inflicts costs on people. Well, what happens when you inflict costs on people? We just discussed that. You generate a transient state of need in that person to defend themselves against that punishment. So if you have this moral dispute where a thief has stolen from someone and someone is trying to punish them for it, the victim and the thief, you can make yourself more valuable to the victim by taking their side in the party and fulfilling their transient need of punishment and recovering their resources. But you can also make yourself more valuable to the thief by helping them defend against this punishment and keep the thing they stole. So by entering into disputes here, people can change their social value to others in a variety of different ways. And in this regard, third-party involvement in these disputes can now get complicated very, very fast. I can help the victim of theft to make myself more valuable to the victim. I can help the thief to make myself more valuable to the perpetrator. I could join another person who has entered this dispute. That is, there's the victim, the thief, another third party joins, and now I can make myself more or less valuable to that third party, depending on which side I take. So that is, if I side with the victim, I'm now siding against the thief and everyone that has sided with the thief. By picking sides in this dispute, I might actually inflict costs on someone who wasn't involved in it to begin with at all. Let's say I punish a thief, but this thief happens to be a friend to somebody else. Well, now this somebody else has a friend in worse condition because this person is getting punished. They're suffering costs. If they're suffering costs, they can't provide as many benefits to their other friends. There are all these direct and indirect causes to our results rather from our involvement in these disputes. It's a very messy interaction, and it affects a great many people directly and indirectly. And we need a very sophisticated series of cognitive mechanisms to try and navigate this problem. So if I'm right about this ingratiation function, we should be able to use it to understand all the components of our psychological moral systems. And we can start with this perceptual component that I mentioned earlier. Our moral psychologies are perceiving elements of right and wrong in the world. but they're not perceiving something that's objectively measurable, like wavelengths of light or sound or chemicals that you smell. What are our moral perceptions attempting to perceive? In my view, what they're trying to do is estimate the needs that are generated by behaviors to a variety of different people. And what are the costs of your involvement in these conflicts, positive and negative? So these are questions like, who was harmed by the behavior? How much were they harmed by the behavior? Would they value my assistance in preventing this behavior? Would they be a valuable social asset for me? Who might I be inflicting costs on by taking sides in a dispute, directly and indirectly? What our moral system seems to be estimating here are these various elements of social need generated by behavior and punishment, both in terms of those directly punished and indirectly affected. And this is why the perceptions of morality that we have aren't objective. Because people are estimating different amounts of need, and they may not value the needs of all people equally. And this is also why some moral violations are viewed as more severe than others. The acts which generate more need tend to be viewed as more severe. Murder is more severe than theft because being dead is worse than losing a resource. So now we can understand why morality focuses so much on human behavior per se. Why do we care about behavior itself? This is the blindfold of Lady Justice, the part that's focusing on behavior instead of social relationships. The reason we focus on the behavior is because it's the behaviors that are generating this need in others, regardless of who commits them. We don't care what non-human things tend to do, morally most of the time, because we can't meaningfully affect our social value to them. You can't make that rock that rolled down the hill and hit someone and hurt them change its behavior. And you can't really do that for animals either. You're not trying to ingratiate yourself to a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs in a different host species. We focus on human behavior because it's these human behaviors that are generating needs that can meaningfully affect our social relationships. And we can also see why our moral systems care about the beliefs of others at times as well. Because beliefs and feelings that people have are predictive of future behaviors. And that behavior can inflict costs on some people, generating needs. So I can raise my social value to someone not just by helping them once a cost has been inflicted, but I can also raise my value to them by preventing behaviors that might inflict those costs before they happen. You can think of this as the difference between punishing a murderer and preventing a murder from occurring. Both forms of these interventions can ingratiate you to other people. And on a similar note, we can appreciate why intentions matter in moral judgments, despite intentions not being in any form directly observable. Murder committed intentionally tends to be viewed differently than someone that accidentally kills someone else, because the intentions behind this behavior send powerful messages about the actor's social value. Someone that intentionally kills others probably values their welfare less and is probably more likely to repeat that behavior in the future than someone who did it accidentally. And this makes the people doing it intentionally look like worse targets of social investment. Similarly, those who benefit others incidentally tend to be viewed as less praiseworthy than someone who benefits others intentionally. For instance, if you and I engage in an interaction where I pay you money, you do a job for me, we're both better off, this isn't viewed as particularly morally praiseworthy because my behavior could be explained by helping you or by me getting a benefit. Whereas if I volunteer at a soup kitchen, this is me suffering a cost to time and energy without getting a benefit back, and this makes it more praiseworthy. In fact, here, to really appreciate intentions and why this matters, I want you to imagine that you are friends with someone who just steals constantly. With each act of theft they commit, your friend is inflicting costs on others, and those others in turn are attempting to punish your friend. You, being the good, loyal friend that you are, stand by your friend through each conflict and protect him repeatedly, despite these conflicts raising costs for you. And here we can immediately appreciate how each time this person is stealing, then, he's inflicting costs on you. And if he stopped stealing, you're going to be dragged into fewer conflicts repeatedly. So all else being equal, would you rather have a friend that's repeatedly dragging you into conflicts or a friend that isn't? We need our moral system to be impartial, to focus on behavior, because that's the information that helps us evaluate whether our social allies are continuing to be valuable to us or what threats their behavior might start to generate. And worth noting, you don't even need to become involved in these conflicts directly at all to suffer their costs. That is, there is such a thing of guilt by association, and it comes up kind of regularly in our moral judgments. There are many examples we could review, but I'm just going to stick to one of these, which is the concept of reparations for slavery, which is sometimes a decently sized topic in the U.S. So no one living in the U.S. today legally owned slaves, and no one alive in the U.S. today was ever legally a slave. But despite slavery occurring generations ago, and the actors and the victims all being long dead, there are still some people that believe the contemporary genetic descendants of slave owners, or sometimes everyone that even shares their racial group, owe a debt to the genetic descendant of slaves, or everyone that shares their racial group. Due to this perceived association between modern people and the groups originally involved in a conflict generations ago, there seems to be this moral liability that some people perceive to exist. Or if we want to put this example more biblically, we have this concept of original sin, where in the Bible, in the story of Genesis, Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, which in turn means that all of their descendants, in this case every human being ever born, is tainted by the original sin of the act, which they didn't commit and weren't even alive when it happened. The larger point here is this. Even if people aren't punishing someone you associate with, their punishment can still fall on you if you didn't do anything wrong. Even if you weren't involved in the dispute, their punishment can still affect you. You might not have done anything wrong, and they might punish you just because you have the wrong friend. Or they might punish you even more indirectly than that by punishing your friend, and then your friend is less able to invest in you because they're suffering all these costs. Indeed, because we want friends who inflict fewer costs on us, who involve us in fewer moral conflicts, this is likely why we see the concept of victim blaming in morality. Victim blaming represents cases where the victims of a crime are condemned for their lack of caution or for exposing themselves to unnecessary risks. That is, you can think of how you might feel differently about someone whose car was broken into and stolen from in two different cases. In one case, they locked their car, rolled up their windows, and hid their valuables. Someone breaks into the car and steals the valuables anyway. Compare this to someone that leaves their doors unlocked, their windows open, and their laptop sitting on their passenger side seat and leaves. People typically will respond to these two situations differently in terms of their interest in involving themselves in the dispute. So if someone is repeatedly victimized, but that happens because they repeatedly behave in ways that increase their risk for victimization, they are likely a worse social asset to you than someone who doesn't behave that way, someone who rarely exposes themselves to risk. In terms of the banker paradox that we discussed before, someone who's repeatedly behaving in ways that signal their needs aren't likely to be transient. They're not cautious, they're not taking care of themselves, they're exposing themselves to risk repeatedly. These are chronic needs. They tend to be worse targets of social investment for that reason. And this is also why you will sometimes see victim blaming coming from the victims themselves. The victims of crimes, will sometimes blame themselves for being so careless and inviting the harm that befell them. Why would they do that? Well, this is probably because they're trying to convince other people that them being a victim doesn't mean they're going to be a chronically costly social asset. In this sense, victim blaming can be viewed as signaling their needs will be transient. They're blaming themselves for their lack of caution, saying they're not going to do it again, and that's why you should invest in me, because my needs are only going to be temporary right now. That was a one-time thing. I'm still a good social asset. Helps you build and maintain the social investment of others by signaling your needs will be transient and not chronic. And this brings us nicely to another very strange facet of moral judgments we discussed last time: the existence of solitary moral wrongs and people's perceptions that you can be a victim of yourself. At first, these moral judgments of solitary acts seem like very strange things to do, because it seems like it creates a conflict where none existed before. You're condemning someone for doing something that only affected themselves. Why are you creating this fight out of nothing? Well, this begins to make more sense when you consider how intertwined people's welfares happen to be in the social world. If I do things that inflict costs on myself, or in any way compromise my ability to provide benefits to others, like if I use drugs to excess, or I were to commit suicide, this makes me a worse social investment. All else being equal. I would be better positioned to provide benefits to other people, and I would require less investment from them if I stopped engaging in behaviors that did harm to myself. And so because of that, moral condemnation of these solitary behaviors can be seen as a natural outgrowth of the behaviors that more directly impact others. You're a worse social investment if you behave in ways that are likely to impact your own welfare, and our moral systems seem to be aware of this, even if the conscious part of the brain that's talking might not be. And we can also use this exact same line of thinking to understand the moral dumbfounding literature we discussed last time. That is, why were people condemning mutually consensual incest in which everyone involved felt better off psychologically and no children were born? They kept raising the possible consequences to these acts. The researchers said, well, that didn't happen. And then they changed their story and tried to think of another cost. And the research said, well, that didn't happen. And eventually these people just said, I don't know, it's just wrong. Why are people doing that? Well, they're probably still condemning that behavior for the exact same reason they would condemn somebody who got drunk, got behind the wheel of a car, and then obeyed all the traffic laws and made it home safe without hurting anybody. While no one in that drunk driving scenario might have been better off in that particular moment, drunk driving behaviors tend to be associated with costs, and those that engage in them are more likely to inflict costs on themselves and others eventually, relative to those who don't. And the same can be said of incest through which no children are born, or gambling in which a gambler happens to win. Taking your life savings to a casino and betting it on one spin of a roulette wheel is still a bad idea, even if you win, because the more often you engage in that behavior, the more likely you are to suffer costs. Long term, these behaviors are associated with risks, and those who engage in risky behaviors consistently are viewed as worse social investments, and our moral systems seem to pick up on that. So returning to the matters of intentionality behind our acts, there's a related concept in the moral literature which is known as the action-omission distinction. An action is something that you do, which produces consequences, and an omission is something that you fail to do, and then consequences result because of your lack of action. In an example, an action would be to lie to someone, while an omission might be failing to inform them about key information you know. In general, holding consequences constant, actions tend to be rated as more morally unacceptable than omissions. So lying about a mistake you made is viewed differently than failing to report a mistake you made. Because when you're omitting, you aren't actually doing anything that's inflicting costs on others. You're just failing to provide others with benefits. And we fail to provide people with benefits all the time. Right now you're watching this lecture. You could instead be using that time right now to help other people in need, but you're listening to me instead. You are, by omission, contributing to other people being worse off. And we do this all the time. You can't act to make people better off all the time, always. That's why omissions tend to be viewed as less bad. We are committing omissions all the time, always. It doesn't send a signal about how much you value other people, necessarily, to not engage actively in their well-being. But there are cases where this isn't always the case. That is, some research by Haight and Barron, 1996, found that this moral judgment difference between acts and omissions was reduced in scenarios where the people were friends with each other. To put this in an example, let's say you work with somebody, and you know this person you work with is cheating on their spouse. If you didn't know their spouse personally, you don't have to go out of your way to find that person's spouse and inform them they're being cheated on, relative to a case where that spouse happened to be your friend. If you knew your friend's partner was cheating on them and you didn't tell your friend about that, you omitted that information, you are viewed as doing something substantially wrong relative to a case when that person is a stranger. And this makes perfect sense in light of this ingratiation function of morality I'm proposing here. If our moral psychology is functioning to locate valuable sources of potential social investment and guide us away from bad sources, what better cue can our moral psychology use than someone's willingness to either fail to provide the friends with a benefit, or not provide benefits to their closest friend, or fail to provide benefits to their closest friend, like help them avoid costs. To put this in a literary example, there's a good reason that in Dante's story Inferno, the innermost circle of hell is reserved for those who committed the sin of treachery, people who harmed those that they had a close social relationship with. Because morality seems to be functioning to manage our social relationships, those who transgress against their closest social allies tend to be viewed as the worst monsters of all. If you know something bad is happening to your friend and you let it happen, either by actively contributing to it or by failing to help him avoid it, you are not a very good friend. And this can make any act seem worse. So with this understanding of the function of morality, we can now explain one of the other mysteries of morality: proportionality in punishment. Why is there this common idea that the punishment should fit the crime? Why does Lady Justice hold a scale? Why do people say an eye for an eye is that's something that you should live by as a code of conduct for criminal punishment? After all, if you're looking to deter an act, wouldn't you want to punish it as much as possible and not in proportion to the damage the act caused? Why are we proportionate punishers? To see why, let's keep running with this example of theft, but we're going to make it progressively more complicated by adding in a few other new details. We'll start off simple. If I stole $5 from you, this creates some need in you to punish me, both because you want to regain your money and to signal you're not going to tolerate theft. Because if you let people get away with stealing from you, then other people will start stealing from you because they know they're not going to get punished. So how large is this need I have generated by stealing $5? Well, that's kind of hard to say precisely. It's a very valuable thing for you to do to signal you're not willing to be taken advantage of, because this prevents future transgressions. That's a fairly decently sized need. The loss of the $5 itself, that's probably fairly insignificant. So this act of thievery has generated some needs to punish the theft and to a slight additional amount of need to regain your money. You don't need to think about precisely how much need, just think about roughly how much need that generates. So because you have this need to punish me because I stole $5 from you, other people can join your side of this conflict and make themselves more valuable enough to you, which makes them a better target of social investment, builds up relationships. Great. Fair enough so far. You have a need. People are taking your side in this conflict to ingratiate themselves to you, and perhaps even to ingratiate themselves to other people who took your side in the conflict. But what if your solution to having $5 stolen from you was to kill me? What if the amount of punishment you wanted to inflict upon me was murder? Now all of a sudden, the relative need generated by the theft of $5 and the relative need of me trying to protect my own life begins to tip the scales in an interesting sort of way. Which of these needs is greater? Well, clearly, helping someone defend against the threat to their life is a more valued thing to do than helping someone protect against a loss of $5. The punishment in this case needs to fit the crime because punishments inflict costs. And people suffering costs become better targets of social investment. If you punish too severely, you can flip these mental estimations of who the better target of social investment is, and the perpetrator can actually become the victim. Sure, I stole $5 from you, but aren't I the real victim in this scenario because you're trying to kill me? That is what seems to happen with a lot of these moral judgments. So now let's add another twist to the story. And let's say the person who got stolen from was a millionaire, and the person who stole the $5 was stealing to feed their family. Does that theft suddenly become any more morally acceptable in your eyes? Maybe it feels less wrong, maybe it doesn't feel less wrong, but what it probably feels like is that it's not as deserving of punishment. It's certainly less deserving of punishment than if you flip the scenario. That is, if you had a millionaire that stole $5 from a family that was struggling to eat. And this is important because when a person is already a member of a social group that is particularly valued, particularly protected, or already socially needy in some capacity, in other words, these people who already represent relatively high-value social investments, moral transgressions against them can appear particularly heinous. For instance, imagine a story in a newspaper you read about a man who killed 5 people. Or you read about a story about a man who killed 5 children. Generally, people tend to rate the latter person as having done something worse, because children are particularly needy and particularly valued by others. You have done a greater degree of harm by harming children because people value children higher than they do, say, the elderly. And it's likely for this reason that you can occasionally see people engaged in what can only be referred to as competitive victimhood. That is, there are some people, I'm sure you're aware of them, that will talk endlessly about how disadvantaged they are by others, how disadvantaged they are by society, how hard their lives have been due to external factors, and advertise at every opportunity how often people transgress against them. To some extent, the greater your degree of victimhood, that is, the more you have been disadvantaged by others, the greater your need and the greater your value is as a target of social investment by others. And importantly, this need is a relative thing. The people who need the most are the greatest, most valuable target of social investment, all else being equal. And this is where the victimhood component this is where the victimhood becomes competitive. Because you need to be a bigger victim than others to be a better social target of investment than them. And being a victim lets you wield great social power because you can coordinate the punishment of all these other third parties. And this is why victimhood tends to get competitive. There's also the matter of moral discoordination to discuss. That is, not everybody agrees in the first place what should be morally condemned. While many people probably agree in general murder and lying are wrong, you tend to find much less agreement in other realms and other topics. Things like, is it okay to use drugs recreationally? Is it okay to have casual sex? Is homosexuality morally acceptable? Should government regulations involvement in the lives of their citizens be a thing that happens? Is it morally okay to eat meat? Is it okay to buy products from certain brands? Is it okay to own a gun? Is it a good idea to be loyal to one's country? And a great many other behaviors. A lot of people disagree on a lot of topics morally. And part of the reason for all this discoordination, for all this disagreement, is that not all acts are equally harmful to all people. And whether you perceive an act as generating a harm or a benefit can depend on what type of person you are, what context you're in, what type of people your friends and family are, and what type of context your friends and family find themselves in. So let's look at one example here to make this a little clearer and talk about prostitution. If a man pays a woman for casual sex, you can really view this as a mutually beneficial act, just like going to the store and buying groceries. The man gets something he wants, which is having sex. That makes him better off. The woman gets money, which is something she wants. She ends up better off. Everyone involved in this interaction agreed to the terms consensually. They both walk away with what they want and they're happy. So why would prostitution be morally condemned? Is it because there are so many people out there that hate scenarios where everyone ends up better off? Well, probably not. And there may well be hidden costs to these acts that other people incur. This is what we would refer to as an externality in economics. An externality, for instance, is if a power plant, let's say, produces electricity and sells that electricity to people, everyone seems to be better off. Power plant gets money, people get electricity, yay, everybody's happy. However, to produce this electricity, that power plant needs to burn coal. What happens when they burn coal? They produce pollutants, and these pollutants can be released into the world. These pollutants are what you'd call externalities. They're negative side effects that are produced from this interaction and affect other people, which are not reflected in the original transaction. That is, people might not be paying the costs of the pollution when they buy electricity. It's an externality. What are the costs of all this pollution being produced by a power plant? Well, that's harder to say. We don't know the extent to which these harms exist. We know they do exist, but we don't know how harmful is it for a power plant to burn 1 ton of coal. That's a kind of a fuzzy variable. So what about prostitution? What externalities might prostitution produce? Well, let's say you're the type of person that wants to have a long-term monogamous relationship. How easily can you obtain your goal? How high quality of a partner can you attract? How likely is it that partner is going to remain faithful to you? All of that depends to some extent on how costly it is to engage in short-term sexual relationships. If a man has a dozen of attractive women lusting after him at all times and can engage in casual sex basically whenever he'd like, his willingness to forego all of his other options and invest in one single woman more heavily is probably going to be reduced. If you're looking for a long-term relationship then, the availability of something like prostitution can be seen as a costly thing, because prostitution is indirectly setting some limits on the value of long-term relationships and remaining faithful to them. So, let's say a man could spend either $150 taking a woman out on a date, or he could spend that same $150 to obtain casual sex directly. What's the man going to do? Is he going to take somebody on a date, or is he going to go to a prostitute? Can't say exactly what it'll do for any given person, but for some people, the existence of the prostitution option will change their cost-benefit evaluation of each prospect. Similarly, if a man knows prostitutes are available at all times of the day, and these prostitutes happen to be pretty discreet, his faithfulness in a relationship may also be undermined to some extent. He may be tempted to divert resources away from his partner and to other women for short-term gratification. So if the availability of casual sex means fewer people are interested in engaging in long-term relationships, that hurts your options as a long-term mater. And this might mean you don't think prostitution should be allowed to exist. You might want to punish people who engage in prostitution to make this casual sex more costly. Because this casual sex is inflicting costs on your strategy, even if it's doing so indirectly. And this example, of course, can be flipped such that women who have a variety of appealing short-term opportunities may be less likely to engage in long-term relationships or cheat in the context of one. Indeed, if you've ever listened to any discussions about incels and a lot of the anger they harbor, not just towards the women who aren't engaged with them, but the, as they would say, the chads that are cleaning up and getting lots of women, they hate both of these people. And they hate both of these people because both of them are making it harder for them to obtain a partner. So moving forward into the sexual realm, let's actually consider something else that has an interesting history of moral condemnation, which is the availability of effective hormonal contraceptives, things like the birth control pill. These can be viewed as positive tools by a lot of people because they allow people choice over family planning. They result in fewer unwanted or unexpected children being born into bad circumstances. That's a good thing. However, these can also be viewed as negative tools because what does hormonal birth control do? Reduces the costs of engaging in casual short-term sex. When there are fewer consequences to engaging in casual sex, like, say, being left to raise a child as a single mother, the more those consequences exist, the less you should expect people to engage in casual sex. Just like with prostitution here, what's happening when it's easier and less costly to engage in promiscuity? The value of long-term relationships begin to decline. The value of promiscuity begins to rise. So now let's apply that exact same logic to abortion. What does the availability of legal, safe abortions do? Well, for one thing, they provide some incredibly valuable medical assistance to women whose lives are threatened by a pregnancy, and they offer other women options for family planning. However, they also reduce the costs of engaging in casual sex, in a similar fashion to prostitution and birth control pills. And this leaves the door open for people's personal sexual strategy preferences to leak into this debate and determine what their views about abortion will be morally. Now, if you were to ask people why they oppose abortion, if they do, of course, you'll likely hear the people that oppose it tell you that they think abortion is murder. Now, if one is viewing abortion as murder, and they view it as wrong because of that, we might expect that their personal preference for long or short-term relationships doesn't really enter into this equation. That is, whether I want a long or a short-term relationship, I would still say shooting somebody in the head represents a case of murder. Yet sexual strategy does seem to affect people's perceived acceptability of abortion. A lot of this rejection of abortion and birth control pills, contraceptives, sex education, a lot of it comes from religious groups. And if we want to see an example of this sexual strategy in action, we have a 2013 paper by Whedon and Kurzban analyzing a massive data set, about 300,000 people across the world, on questions of their moral views and their religiosity, their religious behaviors and beliefs, and their moral beliefs. As it turns out, what they call cooperative morality. These are questions like, is it okay to lie if it suits your best interests? Is it okay to not pay a fare on a public bus, on public transportation? Cooperative morality. These don't predict religiosity or religious behaviors very well at all. What did predict religiosity far better are questions related to sexual morality. These are questions like, is it okay for people to have casual sex outside of marriage? Should prostitution be morally acceptable? Religious morality here seems to be much less about loving one's neighbor and quite a bit more about who one's neighbor is loving. An argument can be made from this paper and other data that a lot of this religious opposition to abortion may have more to do with their strategic interests in increasing the costs of promiscuity rather than viewing abortion as murder itself. And to make this point particularly clear, I want you to also consider some numbers from a Texas Tribune article written by Eric Lau, August 2022. This is a fairly recent thing. And Eric notes in that article that at the time he wrote it, I believe still today, Texas law prohibits abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. However, only about 12% of Texans, people living in Texas, said that abortions should be outlawed in cases of rape and incest. That is, 88% of Texans thought abortion was okay in the case of rape and incest. They supported abortion rights in those cases. Now, if people are truly viewing abortion as murder, as the part of the brain that's talking says, this exception to abortion would seem really strange, wouldn't it? After all, this exception to murder only seems to apply to pregnancy, and likely only to early stages of pregnancy. That is, I don't think 88% of people in Texas would support a mother's right to kill her 2-year-old child, even if that child happens to be the result of rape or incest. Yet, if abortion was truly and consistently being perceived as murder, there really should be no act between a postpartum murder and an abortion during the early stages of pregnancy in the first trimester. And this perception of moral acceptability, this exception, might be telling as to people's probable motives for why they think an act is wrong. Maybe they don't think abortion is murder because they think abortion is murder. Maybe they think abortion is murder because abortion is inflicting costs on a promiscuous sexual strategy. They may not be consciously aware of this connection, but that might be why. That is, if you think about these feelings for exceptions to this abortion rule, they make more sense in light of the fact that a pregnancy resulting from rape or incest does not necessarily benefit a short-term strategy. And there, the costs to the women of bearing these pregnancies can all of a sudden become more important because their welfare is being valued differently. This abortion is not the result of them being promiscuous. It's a result of something else that someone forced on them. They're still the right type of social asset, and so their welfare is valued differently. And one final point I'd like to touch on quickly today is the less discussed positive end of the moral spectrum. These are things that we would call moral virtues. These are acts that aren't condemned, but rather praised. Things like someone heroically running into a burning building to save a trapped child, or someone spending their time volunteering to help the homeless at no benefit to themselves. In fact, as we mentioned last lecture and at the start of this one, many philosophers and scientists writing about morality seem to treat it as a form of altruism or care for others. And while morality doesn't seem to be about altruism per se, because condemnation involves inflicting costs rather than delivering benefits, this perception of morality as a benevolent force persists. To think of this as another example, superheroes exist and do good for others and prevent harm from befalling them, even if that comes at great personal costs. Batman engages in fights with criminals at great personal cost to help other people. He is viewed as a hero. He is morally praised for this. Why are these figures so admired? Now, moral virtues and praiseworthiness here are easily understandable in this ingratiation function of morality. Moral virtues are those behaviors that are credibly signaling the actor's interest in the welfare of others, even if it means they will suffer a personal cost to deliver a benefit. These people are morally praised as they're exactly the type of people you would prefer to have as friends and allies. The people that are willing to go above and beyond to deliver benefits to you. The people who value the welfare of others above and beyond their own. And even if you don't want to be friends with these people personally because they're always running out and helping other people instead of you, selfish as they are, you may still want to socially support them. Because by siding with the person, with praising the person who's doing this heroic act, you're not just praising that person, you are, by extension, offering assistance to everyone that person is helping. So the moral world here truly is a complex place, to be sure. But I feel once you have the correct framework for understanding what you're looking at, specifically one that focuses on this ingratiation function through social investment, all of a sudden the complexity of morality begins to feel a lot less daunting.